Hi, and welcome to the Fulfilling Career Happy Life podcast. This season, I am so excited because I am inviting people in my world, executives that I've worked with or connected with in some way who have achieved the things that we all want to achieve. And the things that they've learned along the way are tremendous. And so they've been very generous in sharing some of those learnings with us. And in that spirit, I am thrilled to welcome Lisa Deschamps today. Lisa and I have very similar backgrounds to a point. We both started as sales reps in the pharma industry, spent some time in sales training, got into marketing, went to business school. Where Lisa and my backgrounds differ is she made the move to Switzerland to take a global role with one of the largest companies in the world. She came back to the US and headed up business units in different therapeutic areas. Then she moved over. She was one of the early commercialization folks in the genes therapy business. She was senior vice president and chief business officer for Novartis Genes Therapies. And then, okay, I'm going to go all fangirl on Lisa because there are times in a career, in my career, where I've had people on my team where I thought this person is going to be a CEO somewhere someday. And Lisa was absolutely that person. And she proved me right about 3 years ago. And since then, she's been CEO and board member of at AviadoBio, which is a really interesting company that's working to develop gene therapies for neurodegenerative disorders that the unmet need there is huge. And so the work that they're doing is tremendously important. So there goes my little fangirl take on Lisa. And Lisa, thank you for joining us today. I'm thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Randy. Say likewise.
So to get started, like reflecting back on your career, very often what I find when I'm working with clients is we identify challenges that we've had or barriers that we've faced that really represent ways that we got in our own way. And I'm wondering if you have any of those experiences to share.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think yeah, it would be surprising if any of us didn't have those experiences to share. I would say probably the biggest one though is just knowing or the recognition that doesn't always go as planned, right? And I mean that in from a career perspective, right? While I'm in healthcare now and I have been for almost 30 years. I started out thinking I was going to be in fashion. So, I hated science, right? Science was not my thing. My kids always think I'm lying when I tell them I barely passed it when I was in school. And so that's like the first thing, right? Like I set out to have a career in fashion. I was, working in fashion a bit, and I ended up getting into healthcare by accident. It was really to appease my mother by going on this interview. And here I am, 30 years later. So, I think the first kind of pivot for me was changing industries altogether. And then, along the way, just, taking so many twists and turns, right? I think, for many of us, we think of career as linear. And actually you learn the most, or I've learned personally the most in, the many kind of sideway moves, in areas where I maybe even didn't even think I'd ever go into, like the one I just mentioned. So I think, that's probably for me, just on reflection, one of the biggest ways where life took me in a different path. And, I went with it, but it was just completely different than I expected.
Yeah. It's interesting what you say about we think about careers as linear and it's sort of the sideways moves that make things interesting. And that's what I love about talking to folks about their career because everybody's got their own journey and everybody goes in a different direction. And I work with clients a lot on sort of taking control of that narrative and how you tell that story because it really is unique for each individual.
Absolutely.
And something else that you said struck me was I had forgotten that you were in fashion early, but I never have heard you express that you hated science, which is really interesting. Like the things that we tell ourselves make a difference. And I could see that might be something that initially held you back.
Yeah, no, I'll never forget the day. It was December 15th. I'll never forget the day that like 8 boxes of anatomy and physiology modules. This is, when before digital, right? Where we actually read books
I remember.
physically arrived. And I thought, oh my God, what did I do? How am I could not barely make it out of high school. How am I gonna, read all these modules and take all these tests and get a 95 or above or whatever the requirements were, and then through these extensive trainings. And as I remember getting blank pieces of paper and you had to recite the entire prescribing information verbatim, from memory. I thought, what did I do? So yeah, I felt it very intimidating. And to this day, I still feel that part intimidating. I'm not formally trained. And while I've, of course, learned a ton and have worked with amazing, scientific leaders throughout the years, it's still not my core background. So I often feel intimidated by it.
It's interesting because that intimidation can act on us in different ways. For some people, it can freeze us and sort of stick us in place, but for others, and I think you were one of these people, that intimidation, that challenge may actually be motivating and may drive you forward.
Yes, you know me well.
I do.
I love a good challenge always. And I always think, for me, it's always about achieving something that you yourself or others thought was impossible. So that is like my carrot, in a sense, where it gives me, I'll work harder, even if I don't have the training, I'll work harder than anyone else to figure it out. But I'm constantly, while I'm working towards it and achieving it, I'm constantly squashing that inner voice that's saying, you're out of your depth. What are you doing? You're so vulnerable. It's just crazy. You can't do it. So I'm constantly fighting against my own inner voice the whole time.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that because so many people that I talk to, we have that inner voice, that inner critic, whatever we want to call it. The things we tell ourselves sometimes, you would never even say it to anybody else. Like we can be that hard on ourselves. And I don't think people would realize that even someone as accomplished as you, even the CEO of an emerging company has that. And I think it's really helpful that you express it because it just normalizes it. We all have it. We
Mhm.
all have it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you
now
for
everybody's
sharing.
going to know.
Thank you for sharing that. That actually is really, really helpful. So reflect on the twists and turns that we talked about with the your career journey. What surprised you?
Yeah, I think, you know, um, how do I put this? I think, again, at least from my upbringing, my father was a very successful, ultimately CEO, but always had very successful career moves. And they were, at least from my perception, they were all linear, right? So in my mind, that is what good should look like, right? And anything outside of that would be a failure in a sense, right? That would mean that, you were not performing to the where you should be and not going in the right direction. So where there were times where maybe I had my eye on the next role, but something else came along and someone said to me, well, you should do this, or we need you here because we need the experience you bring to help, for a critical business need. Are you willing to do it? And my initial reaction was always no, because it wasn't what I expected it to be as far as what the linear correct, pathway looked like. But I learned so much in those roles. So what surprised me the most was how much you learn from those, whether you take those twists and turns because you have a setback, personally, or because someone asks you to do something that, they need help with, or where they feel your experience can be a great, contributor to the overall good, for whatever the reasons are. I just, what surprised me was just learning so much about them. I remember when you mentioned Switzerland, and I was there twice, but the first time I was there, I was coming back, and this was at the end of 2010. And one of my also second to favorite female leaders had asked me to come back and lead a very small brand, like super, super tiny, like, not anything in my mind that I should ever consider. And at first I said no. My initial reaction was to say no because it was so small. The revenue target was not going to be an important brand for the company. Why would I take that? Everybody would be wondering why I took that. That would reflect badly on me for my next move and that sort of thing. And in the end, she convinced me that it was worthy of me, really considering it. And it was actually probably one of the pivotal moments of my career where so much changed. Like not only from the experience I got, my ability to kind of turn it upside down and really look at the opportunity, it provided tremendous, it became so much bigger than anyone in the company ever thought. Um, and then, it gave me a trajectory in a totally different way for the next 5 years. And actually, I think that along the way, you and I worked together. So I met, and got to work under, really great leaders along the journey. So, but just at face value, it didn't seem like an opportunity I should ever even consider and almost felt, beneath me like a punishment, and if I hadn't taken it, I think my career would have taken a different path.
It's so interesting because, you know, I think most of us that are in have been in the corporate world are faced with those twists and turns and choices between things that you have to choose, and it feels like the trajectory of one is so very different than the other. But the reality is we don't get to know until we're looking back on it.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to have faith and then like mine the learning, look back on it and see what you can learn from it, what you can take from it. And there's always something, even if you would define it as something, oof, not sure I would make that decision again. There's always something there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I remember, even when I took it, I was still rationalizing it, right? Like it's still in my head. I wasn't completely convinced that it was the right next move for me, but I was rationalizing it in the sense of, okay, well, I'll get back to the States and then I can decide. I can always leave, I can always do something else, etc. And then, to the other parts you mentioned about me loving a good challenge, then I thought, really, is this all it could be? And maybe we're missing something. Maybe this opportunity is much bigger than we think. And, it got me brainstorming with almost no resource as well. The other thing, actually, that role, why it was so pivotal, really taught me that I constantly reflect on that, even in my current role today, is how much you can do with so little and the amount of discipline you need to have. And you should have that in every situation, no matter if you have a big checkbook or a small checkbook. You should constantly ask yourself, if I don't do this, what happens? And if I do this, what happens? Right. And, that also taught me a discipline that I use constantly throughout even bigger roles with bigger budgets and everything in my career. So, it taught me so many different things that I probably would have never learned that early on if I didn't take that experience. But I was rationalizing it up until the day I was, doing it
Yeah,
and realizing it was actually a really good opportunity.
yeah. It's interesting because when you talk about resources, I've thought about this having gone from huge pharma to I went to a very small company next. And in some ways, I feel like you have to be better when you have fewer resources because you have to make tougher choices.
Yes, constantly. And, given being in healthcare, it's easy. I always feel like it's always easy to get teams everyone's lobbying for their resources. It's always easy to turn people back to them and say, well, okay, if we don't do this, how is a patient or a physician or one of our customers going to be affected? And if we do this, same question, right? And then when you get people to think about it from patient-centric point of view, right? Of, we're doing this for a reason. You get very different answers and you get people stop fighting with one another for the dollar everyone's trying to get. And, again, it's just reminds us how important the work we do are, which I really like about, the industry that we're in and, the fact that it is very purpose driven. You can have a great career, you can bring in tremendous amount of profits, but most importantly, you can impact so many lives.
I've always thought about it as the doing good while we're doing well. And
Yeah.
I've always needed both sides of that. I know you have as well.
Yes, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
So we started to touch on it a little bit, but really specifically, like knowing what you know now, would you change how you approach risk in your career?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. my immediate gut answer is no. And maybe because I probably am I have a higher risk tolerance, than others. Um, it's funny in some respects I'm a bit conservative, but in other respects because I think I love that challenge piece of it. I'm always thinking, strategically, okay, what would need to be true to make that a reality. Which I learned from another great leader along my journey, and actually during the same time I was doing the roles that I mentioned to you. So I think no, I don't think I would change any of that. I think what the kind of path I took um, really, yeah, I wouldn't change it.
Thanks. This question, it I think is so important to a lot of our listeners because, sort of getting back to where we started with what do we do that we're getting in our own way.
Mhm.
Are there things that you worried about that you realize now you just wish you hadn't even worried about?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of them, even going back to kind of what we were talking about before about career being linear and, thinking you have to, kind of only do those types of opportunities. I think, I used to obsess too about I was at Novartis for over 25 years and I'm forever grateful on the amazing career and all the experiences and people I've met and the breadth of knowledge and depth that I've gotten and the investment that the company made in my own, development. But I used to obsess about, it's too long, I should leave, I'm a lifer, and what was I missing by not doing that, right? Like, when you take different roles, I don't think you have to go every 2 years, but when you go to different companies and have different experiences or in different business models, et cetera, you also have a different learning curve, right? And I didn't get that. So my big jump was, within the company doing lots of different things, which was, an amazing journey. But I used to obsess about whether or not that was the wrong thing to do. And could I have gotten better roles faster? Could I have made more money? Is my learning curve stumped because I've stayed within one organization? I still think about that, to be honest. But I've come to terms with it that that was my journey and my path and all the amazing experiences I have, all the things I did get from it, I may not have gotten from doing it the other way. So I don't think there's a right or wrong, I guess is the answer. And it's, each of us have our journey and it's really what we make of it that, really I think is the value.
I really appreciate you reflecting on that. A lot of times, if a client comes to me with sort of, and this is what I hear a lot of, something's not fitting as well as it used to. I need to make a change. A lot of times, what we'll start with is digging into what's behind that
Mhm.
because they may be able to make a change without leaving their company. And you did that. You worked
Mhm.
in a number of different capacities, especially when you moved over to gene therapies, which opened
Yes.
up these doors for you. So a lot of times people can find what they need right where they are, or then they know, having done that exploration, they know what to look for and what to avoid, that kind of thing. So it's really interesting perspective.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely to your point. And I think, that's kind of where I came to the end of my journey before I made the move over to Aviado is that I felt like the last role I had, was so different than the previous ones, not only from the therapeutic standpoint where you can, gene therapies are really, from a scientific breakthrough, that's where I really saw, wow, not only can you change the life of one, in this case, child, which is also amazing in itself, but a family and but a whole community at large. And how could I do more of this? Like anything else in comparison is going to fall short. Now that I've had this experience, it was another kind of pivotal moment. And I think, for me, when people ask me that same question, I often get that question, should I leave? Am I making a mistake? I don't know what else to do. I always say to people, I left when I didn't feel like anything else there would inspire me. And if you start to feel, and there's nothing against the company or whatever, but it just after that experience I just had, I only thought the next experience was going to be outside. Like I didn't feel like anything else internally could be as inspiring as what I had just come off of. I mean, for me, that was the turning point. And I would say that same thing to other people who are asking the same question. I think as long as you're, again, my reflection about having stayed so long, I think as long as you're continuing to learn and grow and be stimulated and challenged, which is very important for me, but also inspired, then there's no right or wrong of staying or going. But once that stops, then I think you know the answer.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me about you is in a number of the things that we've talked about, your self-awareness comes through so strongly. When we talked about your level of risk tolerance, we talked about your need for challenge, your need for inspiration. And you as a leader and as a person being in touch with those things, knowing what you need, you're able to match the situation to provide what you need. And I think that's really helpful for people to think about. Like the only right equation for anybody is what you need equal what you're seeking out and getting. And it's so beautiful to see that you're doing that. Are there other leaders that you follow or any books that come to mind for you that you would like to share? I love hearing these recommendations.
Yeah, so you mean leaders from a public perspective or just in general?
Well, I mean, just in general, but really the reason that I'm asking is resources for people who are listening that
Yeah,
may be
yeah,
inspired by what you're saying and would like
yeah.
to get a little more of that.
Yeah, so maybe I'll answer in a couple different ways. From a leader perspective, there's no one external that I'm following. I would say most of the leaders that I follow, like that I, continue to stay in contact with and learn from, as well as reflect on in my career and how the journey, are honestly, and I'm not just saying this because we're doing this podcast, but people like yourself who I've worked for that have really inspired me, that have, forced me to be reflective and challenge me and give me the space to grow and learn. And I've been really fortunate in my career that I've had a number of them. Carol Lynch also is another one that, and I stole her phrase and I use it. If my team said, "What is the number one thing Lisa says?" It's her phrase, which is what would need to be true to make that a reality. Because it just hit me at the core, like it's so who I am. But she verbalized it, and I stole it, right? But people who have really touched my life, and that also includes my father who has always been, a mentor for me in many ways, of course, across my life, personal and professional, but from a professional standpoint, has always supported me, especially as a female, as a young girl. I used to go on business trips with him and do demos. He was in IT, the time when computers was the size of rooms. And I was 9 years old going on these business trips in these huge, intimidating boardrooms and being like, oh, I'll do it, and showing how easy it was, even for a child, right? And so I think from a following perspective, it's really more about the people that I've met along the journey that have given me support and guidance and that I stay in touch with and continue to grow and learn from. From a book standpoint, there's a few books that I haven't read recently, but that stick in my mind. And this thing might make you laugh, but one of them is by an anthropologist, French anthropologist called Clotaire Rapaille, and he wrote this book called The Culture Code. You may have remembered because I think we did some work there,
I
and
do. I remember vividly.
I still really love this book. And I have my life probably for the last, 15 years, or maybe even more from the first time I was in Switzerland, has been very global in nature, right? And having to work with many different cultures and understanding also what makes people tick. And there's so much in his work that talks about not just different cultures, but really what makes people tick and why people do the way they do, that I constantly reflect and use what I read in that book. And it's also a very provocative and maybe not politically correct, which I love, right? Because it makes fun of each of us in our ways of what makes us special, but also, how you have to work and how you can easily work with lots of different people with different agendas, different cultures, different personalities. So that's a book that I think just in my everyday, the way I communicate or strive to work with people, I think about. And then the other one was and this I haven't read in a long time either, is a book by Seth Godin, who is a very famous marketing author and business leader. He's written tons of books. I've read all of them, but one of my favorite ones, this was an old one, was called The Purple Cow. And it was basically about, if you're going to do something, make it remarkable, is the kind of the essence of the book. And I always think about that. And then there's other books like, Great by Choice and things like that. But yeah, so I get inspired by them. But most of what I learn, I would say, is from the people that I've worked with and the leaders that I've worked with. But I do love to, read some good principles, right, that we can use as tools to help us.
Yeah. It's I love that you brought that up because yeah, there are books out there that we can seek out and there's such value to that. But the value of our network, the things that we have, like the asset we have in the people we surround ourselves with is so rich. Um, and people are so eager to help that I think I'm really glad you brought that up as one of the places to start, one of the things to think about. It's great. Lisa, this conversation has been so great. Any other thoughts that have come to mind for you as we've been talking? You've shared so much, I almost hesitate to ask.
That's a tough one. I would say I think that I maybe two things that I think, I grew up in New York and, I used to think New York was the United States and the United States was the world. And, and this I've been saying for years, ever since I did my first international assignment. And so I would just really say to people, especially younger in their career, go out and if you can, right, personally, if it works for your situation, do something like for me, it was very transformational early on in my career to have the opportunity to do like an international assignment or go live in another country. And it made me more likely to do those things now, but also it just changed the way I saw the world very early on and helped me really appreciate that there's so many ways to do different things, not just the way that I was, very insularly used to. And so that's one. And then I would say also just, and I'm not a huge feminist, and maybe that's politically incorrect to say. I don't ever think about whether someone's a man or a woman. Like, I just think about the right person and, you get on with it. But I do think women by nature, are our own worst enemy. We maybe our inner critic that we talked about at the beginning of the call's voice is louder than it might be, for others. And so, I always say, and I have the privilege to mentor a lot of females at all stages in their career. And I always say, like, it's not a matter of if you want to, it's a matter, sorry, it's not a matter of can you, it's a matter of if you want it. And, and I would just say to anybody, just believe in yourself and really ask yourself that question, because if you do want it, then it's about thinking what needs to be true to achieve it, right? If you don't want it, then be honest about it, right? And
Yeah,
figure out what you do want, right?
yeah.
And so you can really focus your energy there. But that's a hard thing, and I think it's a little harder for women to believe. And I think, and I did this as well in my entire career journey. If you look at it, just to our conversation, I did every brick, every little checkbox along the way to get to where I am today, as well as the sideway moves and things that we were just talking about. Um, could I have done them faster or differently? Maybe. I wouldn't have learned as much, right? So I don't regret it. But, I think we as females just think, we have to do everything before we can ask for what we really want. And maybe that's just something that I would leave, some with as well.
That's great. It's so important. And I think, I coach both men and women. And what I have found and doing some reading about it and things, nearly everybody has that inner critic, that inner voice, men and women. Women tend to believe what it tells us. And we don't have to believe every thought we have. So, it's interesting. It's there, but we give it a lot of power in general. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
great.
for sure.
Lisa, thank you so much. It's been delightful to spend time with you. You have shared so much that I know that it's going to be of real benefit to the folks that listen to this. So, thank you so much for inspiring me and inspiring us.
Well, thank you, and you have inspired me throughout my entire career. So your viewers should know that. So I'm learning from the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Fulfilling Career Happy Life. If you enjoy the show, Please subscribe, follow, rate, and review. Do all the things to show your support for this podcast. It helps other professionals who want to feel more energized about their work again find us. And if you want to take this thinking further, please follow me on LinkedIn, where I share content on a regular basis. You can also get on my email list by downloading the Career Satisfaction Assessment or through my website. All these links are in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. I truly appreciate that you make the time for yourself to listen to the show. See you next week.